Hi everyone, in today's video I will be reacting to a video titled Ben Shapiro loses his first debate. Now this is a debate between Ben Shapiro and the famous Christian apologist Dr. William Lane Craig. So they are debating the historical Jesus. Let's take a look.
Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God. And I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am," and then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
Okay, so just quickly one thing, and this is a very, very powerful part of the video, and I completely agree with Dr. William Lane Craig about this, is it is very evident to see that Jesus claimed himself to be the Messiah and the Son of God in a very unique sense. But one thing I think that is leaving out is also the things that Jesus did that actually where he quoted himself as being equal to God. I mean, there are instances where he claims himself to be Lord over the Sabbath, where he claimed to be the I am that we see in Exodus. Even with his actions, there are many places in the Bible that we see how he presented himself as being God. Even him forgiving sins, that is something that only God can do. And so there are also many examples by his actions where we see how the Pharisees and Sadducees were very thrown off by the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, and that he also showed himself to be God. So this is something that I also wished he just went in on a little bit, and something that Ben Shapiro could possibly kind of, refute or have a rebuttal against. So let's see what Ben Shapiro says.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even.
Right.
Okay, just quickly, Dr. William Lane Craig already responded to this. He said that obviously Jesus was accused of being the Messiah, and because he claimed to be the Messiah, that caused the Sadducees and everyone to say, "Listen, we want to tell the Roman government at that time that Jesus is claiming himself to be the king of the Jews and that he wants to overthrow the government." So they kind of saw Jesus' claims to be the Messiah as a way for him to say, "Listen, he wants to be the king and overthrow the government." So that's why they were able to get him crucified. And that is something that Dr. William Lane Craig already answered. So I'm not sure why Ben Shapiro is kind of going this way in his argument.
There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified.
I definitely agree that wasn't what they expected, and that's why we see how the gospel needs to be preached, especially to the Jews. That's why the Bible says that the Jews rejected Jesus, because they had an incorrect understanding of what the Messiah would be. They didn't understand all the prophecies surrounding the Messiah. For example, Isaiah 53 and all those stuff saying that Jesus needs to be the perfect sacrifice for our sins. So they didn't quite understand that even the foreshadowing of Jesus. For example, when Isaac and Abraham went up to, when Isaac was about to be sacrificed and God provided a lamb, that is kind of foreshadowing of showing how God is going to sacrifice his own son. So definitely we see all these foreshadowing and prophecies that the Jews in that time didn't quite understand will also be relevant to the Messiah. And that's why we see so much of Paul's letters and even other books in the Bible showing how Jesus is the Messiah and how he fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies, and then also in his second coming, how he will then further fulfill all the other prophecies of, for example, overthrowing the governments that there are in the world at this time. So let's take a look.
Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation.
That's also very true. I just wish, again, that we would just go into the fact that Jesus, through his actions and even through some of his words, claimed to be and showed himself to be God himself. So that is something that I just wish he went into a bit more.
Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
yeah, your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims.
Yeah, he's answering this question really well. I would also just like to add there is, if you look at the resurrection of Lazarus, by who was that resurrection done? Jesus. So there again, we see how Jesus is the one who resurrected Lazarus. Only something, again, that God can do. So he's completely correct in saying that Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah, was resurrected. And for that fact, we can see how God is saying this is the true Messiah. But then also, when we look back at Lazarus, then we also see how Jesus resurrected him, saying that I have the power of life and death. Again, through his actions, showing himself to be God. So yeah, it's just something that I also wished he quickly mentioned, because the point that Ben Shapiro brought up of Lazarus in this video or this debate is actually something that kind of is counterintuitive to his debate. So let's watch further.
If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Okay, just before we continue, I just firstly want to examine two things. And so the first thing here is the reason why many scholars, not all scholars, many scholars say that the Gospels were written after 70 CE or after Christ is because of the fact that the destruction of the temple took place in that year. And Jesus prophesied this in the New Testament, saying that the temple and will be destroyed. So they kind of base their theology or their belief of the history of the Gospels to then be reliant on the fact that Jesus couldn't have prophesied this. So they are kind of removing the supernatural from the Bible, and because they removed the supernatural from the Bible, they're saying Jesus couldn't have prophesied this. So that's why we're dating the Gospels after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. So that is something that I don't agree with at all. And there are many good historical evidence to also suggest that the Gospels were written much earlier than that. For example, in the writings of Paul, we see how he is referring to the Gospels already from there. So that is something that's quite significant, because Paul wrote his letters are 50 after Christ, or CE, whatever you want to call it. So that is something that's very significant as well. And then also something that I feel that Dr. William Lane Craig should also go into a bit more depth is that he's saying that he doesn't feel that any other argument for the resurrection of Jesus kind of fulfills everything that he has mentioned. So he goes into the fact that the disciples, all of them, had this radical transformation, that the women saw Jesus at the tomb, the resurrected Jesus at the tomb. And this is something that's very significant, but he can go into a bit more detail, or he could have gone into a bit more detail and said it's significant that women were the first people to see the resurrected Jesus, because during that time, women's testimonies weren't held at the same level than the testimonies of men. So this is further evidence of the Gospels not being corrupted, because if the Gospels were corrupted, then God definitely wouldn't have let, or the people that wrote the Gospels wouldn't have let women be the first people to witness the resurrected Jesus, because that would have gone against the cultural norms. Also, what we see is this radical transformation, and this radical transformation leading to people dying for their faith in Jesus Christ. And there were a lot of people that saw this event, as Dr. William Lane Craig mentioned. And all of these people were willing to die for their faith in Jesus Christ. So it couldn't have just been an hallucination or even a conspiracy theory, because not everyone can hallucinate something so big and be willing to die for that. And then also same with the conspiracy theory. Maybe one person can be insane enough to die for a conspiracy theory, but not everyone who witnessed it. So I wish that Dr. William Lane Craig would just have gone into a bit more detail as to why the other things are not sufficient as something that you should believe in if you look at the history behind Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection.
And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled, to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
Okay, so this is just something that for me doesn't make sense, because he's saying we can go back and forth, but basically Dr. William Lane Craig gave evidence. He didn't do anything to have a counter argument to those things that Dr. William Lane Craig mentioned, and he just said that it's uninteresting and that they can go back and forth, but yet he mentioned absolutely nothing. So this isn't much of a debate in that sense, because he's not giving any arguments against what Dr. William Lane Craig said. So that's just something I felt like it was kind of, you're avoiding this topic and everything that Dr. William Lane Craig mentioned. And I'm not sure why he's doing that, if he hasn't done enough research or if he's really just not interested in the topic. But either way, he's kind of avoiding answering what Dr. William Lane Craig brought up.
You know, on the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s,
yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead.
Okay, so again, are they willing to die for their faith in that? And he also says it's a very small sect of people who believe this. And Christianity, we see the rapid growth of Christianity, how there were many witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. The Christianity grew so quickly because of the fact that it was based in truth, and because there were so many witnesses who saw the resurrected Jesus. So yeah, again, he kind of refutes his own argument by saying it's a very small sect. And then also, can he answer the question whether or not they were willing to die for their faith in this Messiah?
They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have, and they still do that 20 years after his death. You know, that's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experience. Right. So, you know, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So overall, it's a very interesting discussion. I feel like Ben Shapiro didn't really have much to add to the discussion. I don't think it can really be considered a debate. If it is considered to be a debate, definitely Ben Shapiro lost that one. But I don't think they kind of approached it as a debate. It's more of a conversation there. And like I said, Ben Shapiro didn't really contribute anything to the discussion. He kind of just was very reluctant in kind of giving a counter argument to what Dr. William Lane Craig is saying. So he definitely, I would say he definitely wasn't prepared for what Dr. William Lane Craig was saying. He kind of gave a very superficial amount of arguments against what Dr. William Lane Craig said. And so if you want to look at it as a debate, Dr. William Lane Craig would definitely have won this one. But I think they approached it more as a discussion. And because of the fact that it was a discussion, I would definitely say that when you look at what happened in this video, then you definitely also need to examine the fact that Ben Shapiro wasn't prepared to have this discussion, in my opinion. I don't think he should have kind of let Dr. William Lane Craig in on this conversation if he wasn't ready to actually give a bit of counter arguments in this discussion. So I think that's something that I would definitely take away from this video, is that Ben Shapiro was very unprepared. And I really hope that Ben Shapiro realizes that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior. But in this video, I realized that Ben Shapiro has really hardened his heart against the possibility of Jesus Christ being the Messiah. And so for that reason, we really need to pray for Ben Shapiro. And overall, I think this was a really edifying discussion. And I think many of Ben Shapiro's viewers will definitely be strengthened and edified because of what Dr. William Lane Craig said about our faith, and that it is in fact grounded in historical evidence. So after looking at that video and reacting to that video, I really hope that you enjoy watching this video, and may God bless all of you. And please, if you enjoy watching this video, leave a like and subscribe, and please turn on the notification bell so that you don't miss an upload. God bless.